$94,000. That's the number I spent raising my daughter after her mother died. Double shifts, skipped meals, 22 years of making sure she never once felt like she was missing a thing. $94,000 into her college tuition, her first apartment deposit, her whole foundation. And do you know what she did with all that love, all that sacrifice, all those years of me choosing her over everything else in my life? She stood up at my wedding, in front of 16 people, and told me my wife wasn't welcome in my own family. Then she walked out. For 9 years, not one call. Not one. Then she knocked on my door holding a list. And I reached for my phone. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Welcome back to Silent Fortune Stories. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, every quiet person has a story that would bring a room to silence. We tell those stories here. Subscribe so you never miss one. My name is Gerald Hutchins. I'm 61 years old. I live in a modest 3-bedroom house on the east side of Knoxville, Tennessee. The same house I've lived in for over 30 years. The same house where I raised my daughter by myself. The same house where I learned that love isn't always enough to keep the people you love close. I was a railroad maintenance worker. Not the kind of job people write songs about. Not the kind that gets you invited to dinner parties or makes your kids brag to their friends. I inspected track, replaced ties, cleared drainage, and stood in rain and August heat, making sure the trains that carried other people's lives ran safe and on time. I did that for decades, and I was proud of it. Not because it was glamorous, but because it was honest, and because every paycheck I earned went somewhere that mattered. When my first wife, Diane, passed away, Renee was just a baby. Not even 2 years old. The kind of age where she wouldn't remember her mother's voice, wouldn't remember the way Diane used to hum while folding laundry, wouldn't remember any of it unless I told her. So I told her. Every night. I kept Diane alive in that house through photographs on the mantel, through stories at bedtime, through the recipe cards Diane had written in her slanted handwriting that I taped inside the kitchen cabinet so Renee could see them whenever she wanted. I raised that girl alone for 22 years. I didn't remarry. I didn't date. I didn't bring women around. Not because I didn't want companionship, Lord knows I did, but because I didn't want Renee to ever feel like she was competing for my attention. I wanted her to know that she was the center of everything. I worked double shifts so she could have braces. I skipped meals, real meals, not metaphorical ones, so I could put money into her college fund. By the time she graduated, I had spent $94,000 on her education and her first apartment deposit. $94,000 from a man who drove a 2004 Ford Ranger and wore the same 3 pairs of steel-toed boots until the soles were paper-thin. I didn't keep a ledger. I didn't calculate it until years later when someone asked me, and I sat down with old bank statements and added it up. And when I saw that number, I didn't feel resentment. I felt proud, because that money had built something. It had built her, or so I thought. I met Clara at a church potluck in 2013. She was sitting at the end of a folding table by herself, eating peach cobbler with a plastic fork, and she smiled at me like I was someone worth smiling at. That was enough to make me sit down. Clara is a quiet woman. She doesn't need to fill silences. She's a retired school librarian, the kind of person who remembers every child's name and asks about their parents by name too. She is kind in the way that doesn't announce itself. And she is black. I say that plainly because it matters to this story, not because it ever mattered to me. When I introduced Clara to Renee for the first time, about 4 months into our relationship, Renee was polite. She shook Clara's hand. She said, "Nice to meet you." But she didn't look Clara in the eye when she said it. She looked past her, at the wall behind her, like Clara was furniture. I should have looked closer, but I told myself Renee was just adjusting. Her father hadn't dated anyone in over 2 decades. Of course it would take time. That's on me. The second time they met, at Thanksgiving, Renee brought her son Eli. My grandson, 11 years old, bright as a copper penny and quiet in the way children get when they're absorbing everything. Renee sat across from Clara at dinner and spoke to everyone at the table except her. She asked me about work. She asked Eli about school. She complimented the turkey. She never once directed a single word to the woman sitting to my left. I didn't know it yet, but that silence was an adjustment. It was a wall being built 1 brick at a time. When I told Renee I was going to propose to Clara, she didn't yell. She didn't cry. She said, "That's your choice, Dad." 4 words. Flat. Like I told her I was switching brands of coffee. Then she changed the subject to Eli's soccer schedule. The signs were there. I just wasn't reading them. One evening, about a week before the wedding, I overheard Renee on the phone in my kitchen. She didn't know I had come back inside to grab my jacket. She was speaking to someone. A friend, I assume. And she said, "He's making a fool of himself. Everyone can see it but him." She didn't say Clara's name. She didn't need to. I stood in that hallway holding my jacket and I filed it away. I told myself it was nerves. I told myself she'd come around once she saw how happy Clara made me. I told myself a lot of things that made it easier to keep walking forward. That was the last time I would give Renee the benefit of the doubt. The wedding was on a Saturday afternoon in May. We held it in the backyard of our house, the same backyard where Renee had learned to ride a bicycle, where I'd pushed her on a tire swing until my arms ached, where I had buried a time capsule with her when she was 9 that we never dug up. 16 guests. That's all. Clara's sister and her husband. A few friends from church. My old railroad buddy, Marcus. Clara's colleague from the library, Eli, and Renee. We'd set up white folding chairs on the grass. Clara's sister had strung fairy lights along the fence. There was a small table with a sheet cake from the bakery on Magnolia Avenue. Nothing fancy, nothing expensive. It was us. Clara wore a cream-colored dress she'd found at a consignment shop for $35. She looked beautiful. The kind of beautiful that doesn't need a price tag. She carried a small bouquet of wildflowers Eli had helped pick from the side of the road that morning. And when she walked toward me across that grass, I felt something I hadn't felt in 30 years. I felt like the future still had room for joy. The ceremony was simple. Pastor from our church. Short vows. Clara's hands were trembling when I slipped the ring on her finger, and I held them steady with mine, and I whispered, "I've got you." She smiled. Eli, sitting in the front row beside his mother, smiled too. A small, genuine smile, like he was happy for me. And then it happened. The pastor hadn't even finished the blessing. He was mid-sentence. Something about the union of 2 hearts. When Renee stood up from her chair, not quickly, not dramatically. She stood the way someone stands when they've already decided what they're going to do, and they're just waiting for the right silence to do it in. Every head turned. Renee looked at me, not at Clara, at me, and she said it loud enough for all 16 guests to hear. "Your wife is not welcome in this family." The air left the backyard. I felt Clara's hand tighten around mine. Marcus, standing behind me, exhaled through his nose like he'd been punched. Clara's sister covered her mouth. And Renee wasn't done. She took one step into the aisle between those white chairs and she said, "You just replaced my mother with a stranger and called it love. Don't call me when you realize what you've done." Then she turned and walked out. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She walked. Down the side of the house, through the gate, and into her car. I heard the engine start. I heard the tires on gravel. And then she was gone. 16 people sat in silence. The pastor looked at me with his Bible still open. Clara's hand was shaking again, and this time I couldn't steady it because mine was shaking too. But it wasn't Renee's words that broke me. Not entirely. It was Eli, my grandson, 11 years old, still sitting in his chair in the front row. He had watched his mother stand up. He had watched her say those words. He had watched her leave. And then he looked down at his untouched plate, the small paper plate with a slice of cake someone had already set out for him, and he never said a word. Not to defend me, not to object, not to say goodbye. He just sat there, staring at that plate, like the whole world had collapsed and his only option was to become invisible. That silence from that small boy hurt more than anything Renee said aloud. After a long moment, the pastor cleared his throat and finished the blessing. Clara and I kissed. A few people clapped. Someone turned on music. But the celebration was gone. It had walked out the side gate and driven away. I didn't chase Renee. I didn't call her that night. I stood in my backyard after the guests left, holding a plastic cup of ginger ale, and I looked at the tire swing still hanging from the oak tree, and I thought, I gave you everything and you couldn't give me one afternoon. That night, after Clara had fallen asleep, I sat at the kitchen table in the dark. The cake was still out, half-eaten, covered in plastic wrap. The fairy lights outside had been taken down. The folding chairs were stacked against the garage. I picked up my phone 3 times. Put it down 3 times. I thought about calling Renee. I thought about texting her. I thought about driving to her apartment and standing on her porch and asking her to explain what I had done wrong by loving someone new after 30 years alone. But I didn't, because I realized, sitting there in the dark with the refrigerator humming and Clara breathing softly down the hall, that I had spent 22 years chasing Renee's approval without even knowing I was doing it. I had shaped my entire life around making sure she felt safe, felt loved, felt chosen, and the moment I chose something for myself, she punished me for it. In front of the people I cared about, in front of Clara, in front of her own son, something in me was done. Not with love. I would never stop loving Renee. But something in the machinery of my patience, something in the engine of my willingness to absorb pain and call it fatherhood, that thing shut off. Quietly, like a switch being turned in an empty room. I decided that night that I would not call her. I would not chase her. I would not beg. I would live my life with Clara in this house, and if Renee ever wanted to come back, the door would be open, but I would not stand on the other side of it, knocking. For 9 years, that's exactly what I did. Not one call. Not one card. Not one message. She didn't reach out. I didn't reach out. It was the loudest silence of my life. Clara and I built something quiet and good in those 9 years. She tended a garden in the backyard, tomatoes, peppers, marigolds along the fence. I fixed the porch railing I'd been putting off for a decade. We watched Jeopardy every evening at 7 and argued about the answers. We went to church on Sundays and sat in the 3rd pew from the back. We were simple. We were steady. We were happy in the way that doesn't need to prove itself to anyone. And then, 4 years ago, something happened that changed my financial reality entirely, though I told almost no one. A worksite injury led to a railroad settlement. The details aren't important here, but the number is. It was significant. Enough to change things. Combined with 2 properties I quietly purchased and leased in Clara's name, I was no longer the struggling retiree that Renee or anyone assumed I was. I didn't advertise it. I didn't buy a new truck. I didn't move. I stayed in the same modest house, wearing the same boots, driving the same Ranger. Because wealth, to me, was never about display. It was about security. It was about making sure Clara and I would never have to worry again. I didn't know it yet, but that financial shift was about to become very relevant. 3 weeks ago, on a Tuesday evening in November, I was sitting in my kitchen when I heard a knock on the storm door. Not the doorbell. A knock. The kind of knock that sounds like it's already rehearsed what it's going to say. I opened the door, and there was Renee, 9 years older, standing on the same porch where she'd learned to tie her shoes, wearing an expression I didn't recognize, not anger, not grief, but something calculated. Something that had driven 2 hours to get here and wasn't leaving without what it came for. She was holding a folded piece of paper. "Hi, Dad," she said, and before I could respond, she held up the paper and said, "We need to talk about what you still owe me." I stood in that doorway, 61 years old, looking at my daughter for the first time in 9 years, and I felt my hand move toward the kitchen counter where my phone was sitting. I reached for my phone. If you've made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you genuinely. I didn't reach for the phone to call Renee's bluff. I reached for it because the number I needed was saved under a name Renee wouldn't recognize, Harold Meacham, the attorney who had handled my railroad settlement and who had, at my request, also prepared a separate set of documents that I kept in a sealed envelope on my kitchen table. But I didn't call Harold right away. I let Renee in first. She walked into the kitchen like she still lived there, like 9 years hadn't passed. Like the last time she'd been in this room, she hadn't left her own father standing at an altar in the backyard with a broken ceremony behind him. She sat down at the table, the same table where I'd helped her with geometry homework, where I'd signed her college application, where I'd written the checks that added up to $94,000, and she unfolded her piece of paper. It was a list. A literal list, handwritten in blue ink on lined notebook paper. And on it were the things Renee believed I owed her. She wanted money for Eli's college tuition. She wanted the house. My house, the house I had lived in for 30 years, because she said it was rightfully part of the family estate. She wanted Clara's name removed from any deed or bank account connected to what she called Hutchins property. And at the bottom, underlined twice, she had written, monthly support, $2,000. She slid the paper across the table like she was presenting a business proposal. Eli's almost 20 now, she said. He needs help. And this house should have come to me when you retired. You know, Mom would have wanted that. She invoked Diane. She used her mother's memory like a key she thought would still open my lock. I looked at the list. I read every line. And then I looked at Renee. You haven't called me in 9 years, I said. Not on my birthday. Not on Christmas. Not when Clara had surgery 2 years ago. Not once. And you walk into my kitchen with a list of demands. Renee's jaw tightened. I had my reasons. You had your prejudice, I said quietly. Let's not dress it up. She flinched. That word, prejudice, hit different than she expected. She wasn't prepared for me to name it directly. That's not what this is about, she said. It's exactly what this is about. It was about it 9 years ago when you stood up at my wedding and told 16 people that my wife wasn't welcome in this family. It was about it every year you didn't call. And it's about it now, because you came here expecting to find a broke old man in a falling down house who'd be too grateful for a visit to say no. Renee's face changed. The calculation I'd seen on the porch flickered. Something behind it, something less certain, showed through. I reached for my phone. I dialed Harold Meacham. He picked up on the second ring. Harold, I said, I'm going to put you on speaker. My daughter Renee is here. Could you please walk her through the current status of my estate? There was a pause. Then Harold's voice came through, clear and professional. Certainly, Gerald. As of the most recent filing, your total estate, including the railroad injury settlement, the 2 leased commercial properties held in Clara Hutchins' name, the primary residence, and your retirement accounts, is valued at approximately $1.4 million. The primary residence is held jointly with your wife, Clara Hutchins, and is not subject to any prior familial claim. The 2 commercial properties are titled solely under Clara Hutchins as part of the asset protection plan we established in 2021. Your updated will, filed 18 months ago, designates Clara Hutchins as the primary beneficiary of all assets, with a secondary trust established for, and I'm quoting your instruction here, my grandson Eli to be accessible upon his 25th birthday, provided he makes contact with me personally. The kitchen went silent. Renee stared at the phone on the table like it had become a living thing. $1.40, she started but didn't finish. Harold continued. I should also note, Gerald, that the documents you asked me to prepare are in the envelope on your table. They include a notarized summary of all financial support you provided to Renee Hutchins between 1992 and 2014, totaling $94,000, as well as a formal statement that no further financial obligation exists between you and your adult daughter under Tennessee law. I reached for the envelope. I had kept it on the kitchen table for 3 weeks, ever since a mutual acquaintance had mentioned that Renee had been asking around about my financial situation. I didn't know it yet when I'd had Harold prepare those documents, but some part of me understood that this moment was coming. I opened the envelope and placed 3 documents on the table, one at a time. The first was the financial summary. 22 years of support, itemized, double shifts, skipped meals, $94,000. Every dollar accounted for. The second was the property deed showing both commercial properties in Clara's name. Legal, binding, untouchable. The third was my will. The one that included Eli, not Renee. Renee picked up the will. Her hands were shaking. She read it twice. Then she put it down and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen since she was a little girl and I'd caught her lying about breaking the kitchen window. Not anger, but the raw, exposed face of someone who has just realized they have no leverage and never did. You left me out, she whispered. You walked out, I said. 9 years ago, in front of everyone. You told my wife she wasn't welcome in her own family. You didn't call. You didn't write. And now you're here with a list. I picked up her list from the table. I folded it once and set it down beside the cake plate Clara had left out. I'm not giving you this house. I'm not removing Clara from anything. And I'm not writing you a monthly check so you can continue pretending I don't exist between deposits. Renee opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. But Eli has a trust, I said. He can access it when he's 25. If he calls me, if he sits at this table and tells me himself what he wants. Not through you, not through a list, through his own voice. I looked at my daughter, 61 years old, retired, sitting in the kitchen where I had fed her, raised her, loved her past the point of reason. The door is still open, Renee. It always has been. But you don't get to walk through it with demands. You walk through it with an apology. Or you don't walk through it at all. She sat there for a long time. Then she stood up, left the list on the table and walked out the front door. She didn't slam it. She pulled it closed quietly, the way you close a door when you know you might need to open it again someday. If you've been listening for a while and want stories like this to keep coming, it really helps when you hit that like button and subscribe. 97% of people never do, but it's what keeps this whole thing running. So thank you for real. 6 weeks later, Clara's garden is the best it's ever been. She put in raised beds last spring. Tomatoes, squash, collard greens, and a row of sunflowers along the back fence that grew taller than the fence itself. She takes a photograph of each one and texts it to her sister. And her sister texts back a single word every time, gorgeous. That's their whole language. It works. I still drive the Ranger. I know I could buy something newer, something with working air conditioning and a radio that doesn't cut out on the highway. But there's something about that truck that feels like me. It's not about money anymore. It's about choosing what fits. The rental properties are doing well. One is a small commercial space leased to a barbershop on Chapman Highway. The other is a duplex near the university that Clara manages with a gentle authority that makes tenants pay on time and also bring her banana bread at Christmas. She has a gift for making people feel accountable and appreciated at the same time. I've always admired that about her. My health is good considering. The railroad injury left me with a bad knee that predicts rain better than any forecast. But I walk 2 miles every morning along the greenway, and Clara joins me when her hip allows it. We go slow. We don't talk much during the walk. We just move forward together, which is its own kind of conversation. I haven't heard from Renee. Not directly. But Marcus, my old railroad buddy who was at the wedding, told me he ran into her at a Kroger in Maryville about 6 months ago. He said she looked tired. She asked about me. Marcus said, "He's good. Clara's good. You should call him." Renee apparently nodded and said, "I know," and then walked to her car without buying anything. I don't know what to do with that information, so I hold it loosely the way you hold a bird that might fly away or might stay. What I do know is this. Renee lost her job about 8 months after she came to my door with that list. I heard it through the same network of acquaintances who had tipped her off about my finances. She'd been working in medical billing and the company downsized. She moved into a smaller apartment. She sold her car and started taking the bus. I won't pretend that doesn't hurt me. She is my daughter. The instinct to help is so deep it's almost involuntary. Like pulling your hand from a hot stove except in reverse. Every part of me wants to reach out, to write a check, to fix it. But I've learned, slowly and painfully, that helping someone who hasn't asked for help, who hasn't acknowledged why the distance exists, isn't generosity. It's enabling. And I've done enough of that for one lifetime. Eli, on the other hand, Eli called me 7 months ago, a Wednesday evening. My phone rang and the caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, and a young man's voice said, "Grandpa? It's Eli." He was 19. His voice was deeper than I expected, but still carried the same careful quietness I remembered from that 11-year-old boy staring at his plate. He said he was in his 2nd year of community college. He said he was studying to be an electrician. And he said, and I will remember this until the day I die, "I'm sorry I didn't say anything at your wedding. I was a kid and I was scared. but I've thought about it every year since. I cried. I'm not ashamed of that. I sat in my kitchen, at the same table, and I cried while Clara put her hand on my shoulder and said nothing, because she knew that some moments don't need words. Eli comes to dinner now, every other Sunday. He drives up from Maryville in a used Honda Civic, and he sits at our table and eats Clara's cooking and sometimes helps me with the porch steps or the gutters. He doesn't talk about his mother much. I don't ask. That's between them. But he's here, and that matters more than I can say. I've been thinking a lot lately about what it means to owe someone. Renee came to my door with a list, a literal handwritten list, of what she believed I owed her. A house, money, support. She added up our relationship like a balance sheet and decided I was in the red. But here's what I've learned in 61 years of living, 22 of those years as a single father, and 9 of those years in silence. You don't owe people your dignity just because you love them. You don't owe them your peace just because you share blood. And you don't owe them your future just because you funded their past. I spent $94,000 on my daughter. I worked double shifts. I skipped meals. I kept her mother's memory alive in every room of this house. And when I finally, allowed myself to love again, to choose a partner who made me feel seen and steady and whole, my daughter stood up in front of 16 people and told me that love was a betrayal. That wasn't about Clara. Not really. It was about control. It was about Renee believing she had the right to dictate the terms of my happiness because I had spent so long putting hers first. And when I refused, she punished me with the cruelest weapon a child can wield against a parent. Absence. 9 years of it. I don't hate Renee. I want to be clear about that. Hate requires an energy I no longer have and a bitterness I refuse to carry. What I feel is something quieter and harder to name. A kind of sorrow that lives in the walls of this house, in the empty chair at the table, in the photographs I haven't taken down because taking them down would mean admitting she's gone. She's not gone. She's just not here. And there's a difference. If Renee ever comes back. Not with a list, not with demands, but with the simple, terrifying honesty of a woman who is ready to say she was wrong. I will open the door. I will make coffee. I will sit across from her at this table and listen. Because that's what fathers do. Not because we owe it, but because the love doesn't stop. It never stops. It just learns to wait. But I will not chase her. I will not beg. And I will not apologize for choosing Clara, for building a life that includes joy, for refusing to live the rest of my years as a monument to someone else's grief. I am Gerald Hutchins, 61 years old, retired railroad worker, husband to Clara,
Grandvater Torstei Eli.
and I am at peace, not because everything turned out the way I wanted, but because I stopped letting other people's anger decide what I deserved. That's not revenge. That's just living. Clara's coffee cup sits on the counter by the window, still warm. A small ring of steam rising from it into the November light. Outside, the sunflowers along the fence have gone to seed. Their heavy heads bowed, golden even in surrender. Somewhere down the road, Eli's Honda turns the corner. I hear the engine. I hear him park. I hear the storm door open. And this time, someone walks in. If you like this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories.